Now, whenever we go to describe a given system in Jiu-Jitsu, there's always a kind of decision procedure. Okay, a system has a sequence, and you work your way through that sequence. There's also a series of techniques that allow you to punch through that sequence. But underlying all of the technical aspects of a system, there's also the tactical and principle aspects of the system. These are the underlying broad principles that give an overall flavor and character to the system that you're trying to describe. When we looked at the leg lock system, for example, we saw there were 10 underlying principles. There's actually a bunch of them, but I characterized the 10 main ones. And I think people found that was helpful for understanding what the general character of the leg lock system was. Well, of course, the back system too has its own underlying principles, and I thought it would be a good idea to run through some of those founding principles as a means of helping you understand the general character of what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to do when we work with this back system. Let's start off with the first of the 10 principles we're going to look at, the 10 most important. There are others, but I won't spend all day fleshing out principles, but I'll focus on what I think are the 10 most important for you to know. Let's start with the neutrality principle. We have a training partner seated in front of us. Traditionally, the sport of Jiu-Jitsu has always said, when we go behind someone, we want to have an underarm and an overarm, and I control my opponent between underarm and overarm and head position. Between those three elements, that's where the primary upper body control comes from. Then I throw in my hooks, and we add lower body control. Once we get this kind of thing, lower body control through the hooks and upper body control through head, strangle arm, and control arm, there's always been a bias in Jiu-Jitsu to always encourage athletes to fall towards the side of the strangle arm. Now, there's a lot of logic to this. There's wisdom behind it. The idea is that when I have my strangle hand placed, there's an opening through which my opponent's head can move. Remember, the fundamental desiderata of anyone who's trying to perform a strangle from the back is to keep their strangle arm and their head on opposite sides of their opponent's head. This is absolutely crucial to any kind of strangle success from the back. It is the most fundamental demand when you want to strangle someone from the back. My strangle arm and my head must be on opposite sides of his head. If I ever fail in this basic demand, failure of the system overall is completely inevitable. His whole game as the defensive man is always to put my head and my strangle hand on the same side. That's always his gambit. Mine is the exact opposite. I always want to keep my head and strangle arm opposite side of his head. And there's a battle going on here for head position. Okay? Whenever I fall towards the strangle hand, away from the strangle hand, there's an opening between my head and my hand that my opponent can exploit, especially when he's holding my hand down. He brings my hand down, the hole gets wider and wider. And as a result, now his head passes through, and what's he done? He's just put my head and my strangle hand on the same side as his head. There's a sense in which he is now absolutely winning the battle. In order to succeed with a right-handed strangle, my head must be on his left-hand side. That's absolutely clear. However, you can see my fingers are pointing the direction of the escape of his head. When he holds on tight to my hand and moves his head through that opening, he's just won the battle. He's just put my strangle hand and my head on the same side as his head. And that's a disaster for me. What I always want is to ensure that my head is on one side, my strangle hand on the other. The way we do this is ultimately through head position. If my head is poorly placed and my hand is poorly placed, it's inevitable that I will fail. The good news is, however, that if I close the gap between my head and my hand, it's very difficult for me to lose this battle. Okay? Again, if I can carefully monitor the distance between my strangle hand and my jaw, like so, when he goes through that gap, It's very, very difficult. I've closed a circle around my training partner's neck. If the circle is ever open, now there's an escape route, and my opponent can break the fundamental structure that I need, which is, as we said so many times now, head on one side, strangle hand on the other. Okay? The moment there's an opening between my head and my hand, I'm giving him the escape route he needs. And in this sense, the orthodox approach is absolutely correct. Okay? If there's a failure to maintain head and hand on my part, yes, it's easier for my opponent to escape. However, if I'm always mindful of the distance between my strangle hand and my head through the jaw, now when he goes to escape, there's simply no opening for him to work with. I've closed a circle around his neck. The moment my head and hand come apart, the circle is open, and now there's an escape route. Okay? So there's a sense here in which, yes, there's wisdom in the old-fashioned approach. There's a so-called strong side and a weak side. Okay? Let's be clear about this. Throughout most of its history, Jiu-Jitsu has always said, if I fall to the side of the strangle hand, I'm falling to a strong side. Because now, in this direction, there's no opening for my opponent to go to the right. Okay? My right arm is simply there. Okay? You can't just open it. If, on the other hand, for a right-handed strangle, I fall to the left, this is typically characterized as the weak side, because there's an opening between my head and my hand for my opponent to exploit. His head goes through that, and as a result, my strangle arm and my head are now fatally on the same side of his head, which means that there's no more strangle. I can't strangle from here. Okay, the angle's all wrong. However, just by being mindful of this simple idea that I never want to have an open circle around my opponent's neck, but rather the hand and head connected through my jaw, now when he goes to exploit what people call the weak side, he can't. It's only when there's a failure on my part that he can do so. A huge and very important underlying principle of my particular approach to the back system is that it's neutral, left or right. I don't posit the idea of a strong side and a weak side. I'm happy to see my athletes fall in either direction. In fact, there are some advantages to falling to what people call the weak side. Okay? The most important of which you should have gathered by now, which is that it creates an unweighted leg. And that unweighted leg can, under the right conditions, be used to trap an arm and put it pinned underneath our leg, like so. In these circumstances, there's advantages to fall into what many people call the weak side, what we call the underside. Provided I keep my head in good position relative to my hand, so that as much as possible the circle is closed. If I ever feel that I'm losing that position, I will stop whatever I'm doing and control my training partner's head and replace it until we get back into a winning position. But we must never lose track of the single most fundamental demand of the back position when we're going for strangleholds. And this is the idea that my strangle hand and my head must be on opposite sides of my opponent's head. Whenever you feel that basic demand is not being met, you must stop whatever you're doing and address that first and then go on to work. So if I feel I'm losing control of my opponent's head, I will stop what I'm doing, adjust, and go back into work. If I feel his whole goal is to beat me with the head, then we'll pay particular attention to our hand and head position. If the chin is down, I'll just put hand and head together and make it difficult for my opponent to work. Okay? Used in this sense, we can be neutral between falling to the underside or falling to the overside. And so throughout this DVD, you won't hear me talking about a strong side and a weak side. You'll hear me simply talking about an overside and underside. Both can be used with extraordinary success. Don't, as it were, favor one over the other intrinsically, but rather see one as better or worse than the other only in the way in which they're being used. Let's look at our second critical principle for the back system. This is the primacy principle. The primacy principle can be stated very simply. I always put primacy on strangleholds over joint locks. Whenever you look at submission holds in the sport of jiu-jitsu, the basic choice you have is between strangulation on the one hand and breaking limbs on the other. Given a choice, I will always go with strangleholds. As a general rule, especially at world championship level, strangleholds have a finality to them which is not matched by joint locks. As powerful a weapon as joint locks are, if you have a strong-minded opponent with limited time left on the clock, they may be well accepting the idea of a broken arm, a broken leg, or what have you. But there's no acceptance of strangleholds. When they're well applied, you simply pass out. There's no degree to which mental toughness or courage or fortitude can get you through a stranglehold. You simply pass out wherever you are. And so given the choice between the two, I will always go with strangles. Now, when we're on someone's back, there's obviously a vast number of choices we can make with regards how we're going to go in and submit someone. The most obvious one from here, of course, is always the rear naked strangle, the matalion. Okay, but from the same position, I could just as easily go into arm locks, etc., etc. However, because I put a extraordinary emphasis on strangulation over joint locking as a general rule, given a choice between the two, I will typically focus on the rear naked strangle and Ushiro Senkaku, the strangulation using the legs, as my two favorite attacks from the back, because both are instances of strangles. Both are extremely high percentage in different ways. One through the precision using my arms, and the other using the power of my legs will break through and apply strangleholds that will rapidly induce unconsciousness in even the toughest of your opponents. Given a choice between the various kinds of submission holds that we went over in this instructional video, if I ever have a choice, I'm going to go with one of those two. Let's go down to a third of the underlying principles of the back system. This one's very easy to explain. This is the percentages principle. We saw a similar version of it with the leg system. There's absolutely no question that in the sport of jiu-jitsu and the sport of mixed martial arts, the single most effective submission hold in any no-gi scenario is the rear naked strangle, the matalion. Nothing else is even close to it in terms of the number of people who get finished, the finality, the certainty with which it's just the most high percentage submission hold in the game. So the back system that I espouse reflects this, and it puts a heavy emphasis on the rear naked strangle above all the other methods of finishing. We saw many of them, but nothing else is emphasized even close to the degree to which the rear naked strangle is emphasized. The amount of control that you have over your opponent with the arms here is just extraordinary. Between the control arm, the strangle arm, and the head position, it's so hard for your opponent to prevent, once everything's locked in place, to defend themselves from this position that there's no question that if I'm offered my opponent's back, I will always begin with a concerted attack with the rear naked strangle. If I've broken off a strangle, the rear naked strangle into another form of attack, some of the other ones that we looked at, that means that my opponent has sterling defense and has literally stopped me in my tracks for a considerable period of time. Don't just flirt with the rear naked strangle and then switch off to something else. It is your most high percentage attack. The fact that you had to switch to something else should suggest that your opponent has cast iron defenses to the rear naked strangle. As I said, don't just flirt with the move and then go off, oh, I couldn't get it in 10 seconds, let me try something else. You should try and batter down walls with the rear naked strangle first. And only when you're absolutely stopped in your tracks do you go into other elements? Stick with the most high percentage moves. There's a reason why for so long, for so many generations, it's finished more people under more circumstances than any other. Done properly, it'll do the same for you. Go high percentage. Now, a very important principle, which especially pertains to the hand fighting element of the straitjacket system, is the top position principle. Whenever I'm behind someone and looking to strangle, it's very, very important we understand the incredible value of my hands being on top of my opponent's hands, and vice versa. If my hands are on top of my opponent's hands, there's nothing between my strangle arm and his throat. Okay? It's just one quick movement and it's in. But if his hands are on top of mine, that's not true. I have to get through his hands first before I can get to a stranglehold. And so there's a constant battle when we're behind for top position with the hands. In fact, I would go so far as to say who's on top with the hands in this situation is analogous to whose feet are inside in the leg lock game. Just as you will often hear me say, the man whose feet dominate the inside position will always dominate the Ashigarami game, so too, the man whose hands are on top will generally dominate the strangle game from the back. Now, there's a problem here. One of my hands ought to be on top at all times, the control hand, but there's no guarantee that my opponent will always be able to keep my strangle hand on top of his. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. In cases where I cannot get the top hand position with my strangle hand and he's completely shutting me down here, that's when you've got to bring in legs. It doesn't have to be my hands that are on top. It can be my legs too. So when I get behind someone, my first thing generally is to look for two hands on top. Best of all is where you have hands on top with cross grips. That's the king. But I like hands on top as much as possible. If in situations where I cannot get top hand position, then I will settle for leg over the top to replace the hand. Something's got to be on top, either a hand or a leg. Okay? When we fall over to the side, yes, he's got top hand position, but when my leg goes over the top, now my leg's on top of his arm. Okay, now we've got the free hand that we want to go in and start strangling. So whether it be my hands on top or my legs on top, something's got to be on top of his defensive hands. Okay, we want to create situations where most of the time, this is my primary concern here, getting my control hand on top of his primary defensive hand, locking it down. Now, I don't want to get into long, convoluted battles for top hand position with my opponent. He goes in, puts top hand in. I go in, he goes in. And we're just fighting and fighting and fighting with no result. Okay? Once we get to a certain situation where, once I get here, I'm going to use my legs and put my leg on top of his arm. Now, there's no hand left for him to get top hand position. I've won the battle for top. I've got top hand here, top leg here, and as a result, an uncontested strangle hand. But whether it be our hand or whether it be our leg, you've got to have top position. Your limbs, whether arms or hands, have to be on top of his if you're going to get through into a successful stranglehold. Constantly look for that when you're in back position. I'll say it again. The athlete whose limbs dominate the top position will dominate the hand fighting game, leading to strangles on the back. We're looking at the underlying principles of the back system. Let's move now to the hidden hand principle. Of course, the straitjacket system is essentially a system of hand fighting. It's an elaborate system of hand fighting which enables me to trap my opponent's defensive arms so we can overcome what we call the deficit problem. The idea being that when we go to attack an opponent, we've got one offensive instrument, he's got 1, 2, 3 defensive instruments. That's a deficit we need to overcome. Now, one way that we can make a hand fight situation better for ourselves is to hide our hands from our opponent's hands. There's a battle here for top position. If I can get top position, I'm winning. He knows that, and so often from here, he'll be looking to control my hands from top position. Okay. One thing I can do during all this hand fighting is to hide my hands from my opponent. There's different ways in which you can do this. The first and one of the more obvious ones, I know my opponent wants top hand position, but if I took my hand and hid it underneath my training partner's pectoral, he wouldn't be able to access my hand very easily. And in time, as we play the back position, he might well grow forgetful of my hand position. I might well see his chin rise just a fraction, and in that moment of opportunity, my hidden hand comes out and goes into the perfect strangulation position. Okay? So rather than allow my opponent to cover my hand, that's not to my advantage, I will hide it from him, so there's no covering. And then, in some moment of distraction, I will reveal the hand and it'll go into a strangulation position. So I play between concealment and revealing, okay, at the appropriate time. That's the first of the manifestations of the hidden hand principle. The second one is, in my opinion, more important. Once I've actually penetrated the neck and I've gotten into a position like so often athletes will reveal their hand to their opponent by putting the hand on the shoulder. And as a result, their opponent can reach up with a secondary hand, pull it down, and destroy your ability to strangle. Once you penetrate the neck, it is absolutely critical that we hide the most important part of your hand, the thumb, the line of your thumb, around behind your training partner's neck. I don't care if my opponent can access my wrist. That's fine. He won't be able to pull me down from the wrist. What I care about is that he can access my thumb. When he can pull down on the line of the thumb, he can stop me in my tracks. So once we're penetrated, it's very, very important from here that we hide the thumb line from our opponent. I'll even go so far as to put my chin over it. When he reaches up now, he can only access the wrist, and that's never enough to stop us. Okay? There's a third manifestation of the hidden hands principle, that when I make a transition by withdrawing my control hand and I go in, I never want to expose my frame hand to my opponent by grabbing my bicep. Now my opponent can hold the frame hand and I'll never get the figure four set and go into a successful strangle. Not only do I want to hide my strangle hand from my opponent, I want to hide the frame hand as well. So we never grab the bicep and expose the frame arm. Rather, we use the cross wrist methods, where I put my elbow in front of my training partner's shoulder and my wrists cross, just like so. Once the wrists cross, we focus now on hand to bicep and fingers to opposite shoulder. At no point was either the frame hand or the strangle hand revealed to my opponent or exposed to my opponent. So once again, I don't want to have unnecessary hand exposure. I either want my hands on top of his or hidden. When they're hidden, I will take advantage of momentary distractions to quickly reveal the hand and put it into a strangle position. Once there, I hide it. In particular, the crucial line of the thumb, which gets hidden behind my training partner's neck. Now he can only access my wrist. That will never be enough to stop me. Then, it's important too, we never expose the frame hand. So we put the wrist and elbow in place, but never the hand, never exposed to my opponent. Then when the hands cross, we put our hands into the preferred strangulation position and close out the strangle. This principle of the hidden hand will make you a far more effective hand fighter when you're working your way towards strangles from the back. Let's look now at another critical principle of this hand fight from the back, from the straitjacket system. This is the specific grips principle. When I'm behind someone, it's extremely important how I go to grip my opponent. Let's understand there are two main forms of grip whenever I'm behind my opponent and working to control his hands. There are the so-called straight grips, where my left hand controls my opponent's left hand, and my right hand controls the right hand. Whenever we use straight grips, the target of our control is your opponent's knuckle line. It's illegal for me to grab fingers, especially if it's single digits, but it's fully legal for me to grab all four of my training partner's knuckles. This creates a much stronger control by controlling the end of the lever and enabling us to press our training partner's hand to his rib cage, so that when he goes to free his hand, it's enormously difficult. If I grab the wrist, on the other hand, my opponent can easily extend his arm and break the grip. So whether I'm grabbing my opponent's secondary defensive hand or primary defensive hand, with these straight grips, it's the knuckle line which is the target of our grip. This all changes when we go to cross gripping. When we go to cross grip, we want to take our thumb underneath and take the inside position on our training partner's wrist, so that the area where the veins of the wrist are manifested, that's our target. Then we hold on the wrist this time, okay? Holding in just like so. So when my opponent goes to pull away, his elbow is locked to his own ribs, and my elbow on the other side is locked to the ribs. Best of all is when we have both of our training partner's wrists controlled. The principle that's being used here is similar to the principle of a straitjacket. As a straitjacket restrains my opponent like so, by locking his arms in such a way that only the weak rotator cuff muscles of the shoulders can be used for escape. When he tries to pull away, it's so difficult. His elbows are wedged in tight to his body. The second principle that's involved in a cross grip is that of a rope and a knot. Just as you can enhance your grip of a rope by tying a knot at the end of it so that your hand slides down the rope and catches on the knot, so too the human hand slides down the forearm and catches on the knot of your training partner's hand. The forearm starts thick, then thins down to the wrist, and then thickens again at the hand. My hand slides down the rope of the forearm and sticks on the knot of the hand. Used together, when my opponent goes to pull away, it's so difficult. Between the straitjacket effect and the rope and knot effect, it's very, very hard for them to break away. So let's be sure that when we're behind people and we're working with our two primary forms of grip, straight grip and cross grip, that we know exactly what we're doing. We grip quite differently in the two cases. Straight grips, we dominate the knuckle line, pressing everything into the ribs, so when he goes to pull away from us, it's a difficult thing for him to achieve. Even better, the so-called cross grips, where the inside area of the wrist covered by the veins is the target of my thumb. The fingers come over the other side and we hold in like so. This creates a straitjacket effect where my opponent tries to pull away. Only the weak rotator cuff muscles of the shoulders enable him to do so. It's hard for him to break away. It's hard to develop the strength to do so. In addition, my grip tends to function like a hand on a rope, which slides down to a knot at the end. So when he goes to pull away from us, it's a very difficult thing indeed. Gripping in this fashion, using these specific grips for straight grips on the one hand, cross grips on the other, will make you a very effective hand fighter when you're working for your strangles from the back. Now, let's go further into the principles underlying the back attack system. I want to spend some time now on what I believe is one of the absolute most important of all the underlying principles of the back position, the default principle. We know that essentially when we're behind someone, there's essentially a hand fight going on here where we're trying to get top hand position and ultimately throw a leg over our training partner's arm and create a situation where both of his arms are trapped and we have an uncontested strangle hand to go in and finish the strangle. Now, whenever you're involved in a vociferous hand fight with your training partner, there's going to come opportunities where your training partner's chin rises. Okay, that's entirely natural because you're engaged in hard hand fighting. He gets distracted. Okay, so as we work in situations like this, there's going to come periods where you just see that chin rise. I only need my opponent's chin to rise the width of my wrist. It's not much. We're not asking for a lot here. We don't need someone looking at the ceiling or anything crazy like that. Okay, all you need is the width of your wrist. Measure it yourself. It's not that big. If we turn side on to the camera, here his chin is on his chest. That's actually a it's not painful, but it's an uncomfortable and energy-consuming posture for my opponent to take. To keep his chin on his wrist is not easy. In the midst of a hard hand-fighting struggle, inevitably it will rise to some degree. Now that doesn't look like much of a rise, does it? Just a small change in angle. Well, here he can stop my wrist. Here he can't. That small change in angle was more than enough for me to get the width of my wrist inside and underneath my opponent's neck and penetrate the neck. This is where the default principle becomes so important. As we engage in a hand fight and we're looking for top hand position, I detect that my opponent's chin has risen to some degree. Whenever I see the chin is away from the chest by the amount of the width of my wrist, whenever that occurs, and as soon as it occurs, in one motion, my hand will go in and solidify the entrance, the penetration, which ultimately leads to the stranglehold. This has to be a hardwired instinct on your part. This can't be something you think about later. Oh, I had an opportunity. No, no, no. The second you see that rising at the chin, we're here in the hand fight, boom, the hand goes in. And of course, the hidden hand all the way around and behind, and we go into the finish. This must be something which you instinctually go into. It can't be, as I said, something you have to consciously think about. Unless your opponent's chin is physically stopping you, you should be going in on that default principle. The moment the chin rises to even a small degree, we go straight in and start to attack with a stranglehold. There has to be an absolutely constant threat of your arm penetrating the neck and going through into the stranglehold. This will keep your opponent honest with his chin position and form distraction on the part. If he focuses so hard on the chin position, it's going to become easier for you to win the hand fight battle and start throwing legs over arms. And you play your opponent in a dilemma between dominating the arms, and then as he reacts to that and lifts the chin, going back into the default, the immediate attack on my opponent's neck, which should occur at any time our opponent's chin lifts higher than the width of our wrist. As I said, this has to be a hardwired instinct on your part. This should occur almost on autopilot. Anytime the chin rises even that minimal degree, the hand shoots in and we work immediately for the stranglehold. If we get frustrated, we go back to the hand fight and try to trap the arm. Play your opponent off between the default principle and the trapping of the arm with one of your legs, and believe me, you'll be a hard person to stop when you're fighting for strangles from the back. We're running through 10 of the major principles that characterize the back system. Let's go now into the hierarchy principle. This is the idea that when we work behind someone, there's a hierarchy of hand fighting positions that we can go into. Okay, we know that in general we like to have our hands in top position. If we're going to have a hand on bottom, we'll accept bottom hand on the strangle hand, not so much on the control hand. It's very important that we always get top hand on the control side. I can tolerate bottom hand on the strangle side because ultimately I can always use my legs to back me up on that side. Okay, but here on this side, the control side, I'm always looking hard for top position. If I feel I've ever lost top position on either side, I can always pull my hand back in the direction of weakness and go in and seize my opponent on top. Okay, he will be doing the same thing, twisting and turning away and looking for his own top position. So there's a strong hand fight here. We've seen that when we work here, the hierarchy of hand positions goes between top and bottom. That's one kind of hierarchy. And the other is between straight grips and cross grips. Okay. Because of this, we can start to create a sense of hierarchy that when we work with straight grips, the bottom of the hierarchy, the absolute undesirable bottom, would be me with 2 straight grips on bottom. This would be undesirable. Okay. From here, we can just pull our hand back and take top position. And this brings us to an adequate grip. It's not a great grip, but it's adequate for our purposes because we do have top hand on the control, but we've got bottom hand straight. We've got 2 straight grips, 1 top, 1 bottom. We could take our opponent's hand down below the line of his chest, and from here, hook over the top, and now we're in a winning position. We have an uncontested strangle hand ready for the strangle. How do we grade the hierarchy? Well, ultimately it comes down to one thing. It's our ability to take our opponent's secondary hand below the line of his chest. The line of the chest is usually pretty easy to identify on most healthy males. It's the line of the pectoral muscles, just like so. I always want his hand, especially the thumb, below that line. If my opponent's hand is above the line of the pectorials, it takes a considerable amount of flexibility to be able to hook your opponent's arm. When the hand, in particular the thumb, goes below the line of the pectorials, it takes very little flexibility to be able to put my opponent's hand behind the back and lock it up. So how we grade the various hand fighting positions is basically based around that simple idea. How good is this grip at keeping my opponent's wrist and thumb and hand below my training partner's pectorials? Okay, we've seen that from here, the bottom of the hierarchy is one where he's grabbing my hand. He has top hand position on the strangle side, and we just push our hand down, come over, catch, and put it behind. A slightly better, more controlling would be where I have two straight grips on top. And now I can physically push my opponent's hand down below the pectorials and go in and make a good hook. Cross grips are even better than straight grips for the simple reason that we get an effect rather like, as we discussed earlier, a rope with a knot at the end of it. So when he goes to pull away, that knot effect makes it very, very difficult. Moreover, because I control the inside wrist and can easily glue my opponent's hand down to his own chest, it strongly controls my opponent's elbow on the one side and enables me to use my own elbow as a wedge around my opponent's rib cage. So when he goes to yank his arm free, it's shockingly difficult. This makes it very easy for me to maintain his wrist well below the pectoral line, and as a result we can easily hook onto our training partner's arm and clear it behind the back. The minimum that I need when we work in these situations is what we call single cross, where I take a single cross grip and hold one hand just like so. His other hand can be anywhere it wants. Just by holding the one hand, that's more than enough for me to trap, and then from here get my control, and then ultimately come back to a control grip here and lock up. Okay. However, most of the time we like to work with two hands gripping our opponent. So once we get the cross grip here and hold it down, we have single cross. Our opponent may well grip our wrist so that we can't strangle him. Okay, let go. From here, if he doesn't monitor my strangle hand, I'll go right in and strangle right here. So of course he's interested in locking on tight. Now from here, I bring my foot over and put his hand behind the back. Then I punch through, strip his grip off, and what have we got? An uncontested strangle hand for the finish. But best of all, however, the top of the hierarchy, so to speak, is a situation where I have a cross grip, a single cross grip from my opponent, and he goes to peel my hand off. Not a bad move on his part, because if he succeeds, he frees himself. However, by trying to take my hand off, he exposes himself to a double cross grip, the strongest of all the grips from here. When he goes to pull away from me now, it's shockingly difficult, and as a result we can easily pass the foot over the top, lock in, and find ourselves with an uncontested strangle hand ready for the win. Once we understand this simple hierarchy of hand fighting positions, you'll know exactly what you want to look for. You'll look ultimately for the top of the hierarchy, double cross grips, which make it an easy thing for you to force your opponent's secondary defensive hand down below the low of the pectorials, and as a result you'll have an easy time hooking onto your opponent's arm and creating your own uncontested strangle hand. Now we're going through the underlying principles of the back system. Let's look now at one of the crucial ones for the system overall. This is the concentration diffusion principle. We've seen that most of the back system, the primary interest that it has is a hand fighting system designed to set up the most high percentage of all the finishes from the back, the rear naked strangle. Okay, so most of what we do is an elaborate hand fighting system designed to create situations where my opponent's arms are bound up and controlled by arm and leg, and from here we can go in and attack the number one move of the sport for as far as finishing percentages goes, the rear naked strangle from the back. Now let's understand something. The rear naked strangle is a move utilizing my arms against a very specific part of my opponent's body, the neck. Very localized, small thing. So what have we got here? We've got one weapon, the rear naked strangle, being used against one very specific part of my opponent's body, the neck. So you've got essentially a battle here for concentration of force. My one arm has to penetrate a very small area and go through into one move, the rear naked strangle. So I know what I want to do, he knows what I want to do, and he's going to localize all his defensive forces around that one specific area that I'm attacking, and I need an elaborate method of tying up those defensive forces however we were doing it so that I can fight my way through and get to the strangle. So the whole emphasis on the part of the straitjacket system is concentration of force. Everything's about one weapon fighting through a very small area against very strong defenses. Then we've got the auxiliary systems, which have a completely different modus operandi. They are designed to diffuse our attacks over the whole body, a wide array of attacks, many different attacks, submission holds of every kind, arm locks, leg locks, strangle holds, even spinal cranks, etc., etc. So we have a wide array of attacks over the length and breadth of the human body. So the auxiliary systems have a diffusing element, which put, as I said, a large number of attacks over the whole body. The straitjacket system, the main part of the system, is the opposite of that, which is just one weapon breaking through a very localized, heavily defended part of my opponent's body. By playing those two against each other, concentration of force on the one hand and diffusion of targets on the other, that's how we achieve the breakthrough. You create a tension in your opponent between very concentrated attacks on one part of the body on the one hand, and then substituting that to various means of switching attacks. On the other. By playing those two off, concentration of force versus diffusion of attacks on the other hand, you're going to break through a lot of people. We're going through 10 of the major underlying principles that give character to the back attack system. Let's look now at the closed wedges principle. You will probably remember from the leg lock DVD that I have a preference for closed wedges over open wedges in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases I do favor them. They add a kind of security of grip, which can be very, very useful. Now, in the case of the back, you'll see that my knees function as wedges around my training partner's body and offer lower body control. Okay, the basis of my hooks is really my knees. People always understand it as your lower legs, the area from the knees to the feet. In fact, it's more about the knees themselves. You can clearly see this with a simple experiment. That when we take our feet out and place them in what in America would be called a crab ride position, you still have excellent control of your opponent's hips just from your knee position without any hooks inserted at all. Once you understand that the knees are the focus of control from the back, you can see that when we work with open feet, it's relatively easy for my opponent to first beat my foot and then critically beat my knee and escape the back position. So, anything we can do to prevent our opponent beating the foot first and the knee second is going to be money in the bank. So when I fall to a given side, it's often a good idea to get my foot as high up as possible and keep my feet as close together as possible so that the wedges, my two knees around my opponent's body, get locked in place. Now, the single strongest lock you can form in these situations is always the figure of four, the body triangle. This means now that my two knees are simply locked in place around my opponent's body. When he goes into any kind of attempt to misalign his body from mine, it becomes significantly more difficult for him to do so. Whether my leg is locked on the outside, which is generally my preference, or my second preference on the inside, these are going to lock the wedges of your knees around your opponent's body in a very, very strong and satisfying way. Now that we've done that, now we can take our time, start to win the hand fight, and then from there, start pinning arms down. Now, realistically, in a gym, you're going to be expected to go with people well outside of your own body weight. And it's not always going to be realistic, given your body versus your opponent's body, that you're always going to be able to lock a body triangle around your opponent's midsection. I was born with relatively short legs for my height, and so for me it's often a struggle on someone generously built through the waist to lock a successful body triangle. In cases like this, another closed wedge that we can use is to take our training partner's body and lock over with crossed feet over our training partner's hip, like so. This too has a very strong wedging effect, and when my opponent goes to turn his hips and misalign himself from me, it's a difficult thing for him to achieve. These locked feet over one hip are almost as good as the body triangle option, and very useful in situations where you have shorter legs or your opponent is generously built through the waist. There's always going to be that guy who's so generously built through the waist and hips that you can't even achieve this. In these cases, I generally recommend the foot on the hip and a post of your right foot on the hip pushing down and the left foot coming up like so. You don't need to lock your feet here, just have your feet close together. And in this way, your feet are not locked, it's not a truly closed wedge, but they're so close together that you get most of the benefit of a body triangle without the necessary leg length or thinness through your opponent's waist that would be required in the case of a true body triangle. But when my opponent goes to move around here, even though this is technically still an open wedge, it's still a lot more closed than if I just have my feet in a symmetrical position like so, where even small movements will enable him to quickly beat my hooks. So, ranking in order of importance, if possible, either because my legs are long enough or his waist is slim enough, when we can lock the full body triangle on the outside, that's our general preference. Body triangle on the inside would be next after that. Also very good is to lock over my training partner's hip with crossed feet, like so. In certain situations, provided I don't cross my feet in the middle, it's even fine to cross my feet in situations here. I wouldn't recommend it between your training partner's legs, then you can run into problems, but we've seen some simple solutions to this in the past. In situations where my opponent's so thick through the waist and my legs are so short that even these things are not possible, just post on your training partner's hip and bring the foot up to your own foot. And in this way, your feet are as close to being closed without actually locking as they can be. And now when my opponent goes to move away from me, it's hard for him to beat the bottom hook. What we want to avoid is situations where we simply have our feet in a symmetrical position where we can easily go over. Now, if for whatever reason, usually because my legs are very short and his waist is very large, that I can't even get any kind of closeness on the part of my feet, forget about a lock, I can't even bring my feet close together, I have to work with open feet like so. In these situations, the closure has to be with your upper body. So we'll take our hands and lock them here like so. Okay. Now, when my opponent goes to move away, even if he beats the bottom control, we still have good control with the top upper body grips. And we've got a locked, closed wedge around our training partner's head and shoulders. And from here, it's not so hard for us to start coming up and turning people over and going back into winning positions. So the general rule is, when we have a choice, if our legs are long enough and our opponent's waist is slim enough, I generally tend to favor body triangles, variations of body triangles, or closed feet, any kind of closed wedge that inhibits the movement of my opponent's body so he can't misalign his body with mine. In cases where that's just physically impossible, I should at least bring my feet as close together as I can through the use of a post rear mount. In cases where even that's not possible, then the closure has to come from the upper body, and we lock up a tight seatbelt around our opponent and use that to maneuver around our opponent's body and make up for the failure to get closed wedges in the lower body with closed wedges at the upper body.